A lot of our events are now live streamed here at Books and Books, so if you can't make it here to the store, of course we prefer you to be here, but if you can't, you can always go to the internet and watch us online at your convenience. Also take a look at our Books and Books newsletter. This will give you a rundown of all the wonderful events we have at Books and Books every night of the week. A couple of note worth mentioning. Upcoming, BJ Novak. We've got Dave Barry coming, Chelsea Handler, Sue Monk Kid, any number of wonderful events, as I say. You do not have to take this with you. You can always go to our website, give us your email address at booksandbooks.com, and that way we can send you an email blast of everything that's upcoming. And also, this Friday coming up, Valentine's Day. I don't know what could be more romantic than Romeo and Juliet, but here at the bookstore, we're going to have some dinner specials and some live music and some romance going on out in the courtyard. So come to the store with your significant other and take advantage of that as well. But tonight is tonight. In the houses of Montague and Capulet, there is only one goal: power. The boys are born to fight and die for honor, and if they survive, marry for influence and money, not love. The girls are assets to be spent wisely. Their wishes are of no import. Their fates are written on the day they are born. Benvolio Montague, cousin to Romeo, knows all this. He expects to die for his cousin, for his house, but a spark of rebellion still lives inside him. At night, he is the Prince of Shadows, the greatest thief in Verona, and he risks all as he steals from the house of Capulet. In doing so, he sets his eyes on covenant-bound Rosaline, and a terrible curse begins that will claim the lives of all in Verona and will reunite their fates forever. Rachel Caine is the New York Times USA and international best-selling author of more than 40 novels, including the Morganville Vampire series, the Weather Warden series, the Outcast Season series, and the Revitalist series. She grew up in West Texas as a graduate of West Texas University with a bachelor's degree in accounting with a minor in music. She's been writing and publishing novels and short stories since 1990. She's a former professional musician who has the distinction of having played with such musical legends as Henry Mancini, Peter Nero, and John Williams. She's also an avid movie buff and TV watcher. She says she prefers a good stout Guinness to wimpy American beers. Caine does most of her writing in a coffee shop near her home and listens to music while she writes, the playlist changing from project to project. We are very fortunate to have her with us this evening. Please give a warm welcome to Rachel Caine.
You notice I have the backpack with me? That's because I was riding in the car. Hi, everybody. I am not a formal person, but I will say I've not been live streamed on the internet before, so this is new and exciting. So forgive me if I start getting faint or something, but I don't think I will. I've been writing, obviously, a long time. I started writing when I was 14 years old. And it was because I was given an assignment by a teacher. I always try to credit people who pushed me the right direction, and there's been a lot of them. But this teacher really inspired me to think out of the box. The class was given the assignment, and it's called a prompt. She gave us a sentence and said, write a short story around this particular idea. And the sentence, because I've never forgotten it, was, the clock struck 12 and everything changed. And I thought, wow, there's a lot you can do with that. You could write so many stories. So I ran home and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote and I came back and I was very proud of my story because this was well before Harry Potter. I wrote about a dusty West Texas street in the Old West and two gunfighters getting out on the street to duel, only they were dueling with wands instead of guns. And so there was magic in the Old West. And I thought it was very original, and the teacher was like, what? So even then, I was a little ahead of my time. But most everybody in my class wrote the same story, which was the clock struck 12, and this class was over, and I could go to lunch, the end. It was real life, I'll give it that. There were two other people that didn't write that story, and one was a guy who wrote about the clock struck 12 midnight, and monsters came out to eat everyone who'd ever been mean to him. The teachers were concerned, and I later dated him. He's now in a rock band. There was another girl who wrote a story about the clock struck 12 and Cinderella was at the ball. And instead of her turning back into the serving girl, everyone else turned into servants. She was queen. I don't know where Prince Charming it was. He didn't even show up. So I liked her too. So that was how I got started writing. And I wrote constantly and I hid it because I was afraid of people might look at it. They might read it. And then what would I do? So I would put it in suitcases or drawers. I would take great pains to hide it from people on the bus. Eventually, someone found it and read it out loud on the speaker, and then I thought I'd never write again. But I did. And I kind of went along like this while I was planning to be a professional musician, and still not letting anyone read it, not sending it in. And a friend of mine, who is the second person that I owe a great debt of gratitude to, decided he would push me out to being a writer. So what he did was he bought a ticket to a writer's conference and told me we were going to lunch. Then he handed me my ticket, pushed me out of the car, and said, "Good luck," and drove away. So I thought, well, I better go in because he has bought me a ticket, paid good money for it. I should go in and at least try to talk to people. I did. And I met my first editor at that conference. Now, I did the worst sales job in the entire world because when I talked to him, he said, "Well, what have you written?" And I said, "Well, not much." "What kind of thing do you like to write?" "I don't know." I have no idea why he went to the extreme of saying, "Well, would you send me something?" But he did. And I sent him a half-finished story. He thought it was a partial novel, so he hired me to write the rest of the book. I didn't even know how to write a book, but I did it. And it was in 6 months, I had the book done and it was turned in. And that was the start of my professional career. And it seemed like every time I started to falter, there was someone there to push me to trying a little harder. Fast forward to about the year 2000. I was kind of in a low place in my career and I couldn't think of anything to write. And the idea I had didn't seem too exciting. And I was at a conference and I was talking to a writer I really respected. And he said, "Well, what are you thinking about writing?" And I said, "Well, I don't want to tell you because you're going to think it's stupid." He said, "Well, tell me." I said, "Okay, I'm thinking about this idea about a woman haunted by bad weather who actually can control the weather, and there's a whole organization." I gave him the whole story. And he said, "Well, dang, I wish I'd written it. You should go write that." And I did, and it became Ill Wind, and it was the first Weather Warden book. So that went on for 9 books in that series. And then about halfway through that series, they asked me if I wanted to do young adult. And once again, I thought, oh, I can't do that. So I called a friend of mine, because now I'm sensible enough to know my friends are far smarter than I am. And I said, "I don't think I can do this. What should I do?" She said, "Well, surely you have an idea. You always have an idea." And I said, "I really don't." I was driving home from work. It was very dark. And she said, "Tell me the first thing that pops into your head." And I said, "The street lights are really far apart," which doesn't sound like much of an idea. And she said, "Why?" And out of nowhere, I said, "Well, if vampires built a town, they would put streetlights really far apart, so you would have farther to run to get to safety." She said, "Vampire urban planning. I have not seen that before." And I hadn't either, so I decided that would be what I did. And that became the Morganville Vampire series. So that's how I got started. Since then, when I updated the bio, I had to go back and count books because I never really think of how much I've written behind me. I always think about what I'm going to do next. But when I started counting up books and I realized I'd passed 40 in the last, not quite, 20 years, just about 20 years, it stunned me because honestly, that's a lot of work. But I'm still going on, and I've got 6 more books that are going to be written in the next 2 years. And I just did a deal for one of those series that going to start coming out, I think, in spring of 2015. And it's Novels of the Great Library. And the premise is, what if the Great Library of Alexandria wasn't destroyed? So it's got a huge world building. So I'm a little nervous, but I'm working it. I can tell you a little bit about what's going on in TV and film, because that's crazy. This is how TV and film works. Usually it doesn't. You get exciting phone calls from producers who say things like, "I love this series. You know, we're gonna make it, and it's gonna be fantastic, and everyone will love it, and you're gonna make a whole lot of money. It's great." And then they'll go away, and you never hear from them again. That's how it happens. Occasionally, they will come back and they will option the work, which means they actually pay you to do nothing with it. They have a set period of time in which to try to get something made. If they don't, then you get it back, and someone else comes and gives you money for the same thing. It's a pretty good racket. But I've had several options, especially on Morganville, and nothing ever really happened. So right about the time the last option expired, we decided, I was talking to a friend of mine, and we decided to explore this whole idea of a web series because there were so many interesting things being done. And right about the time we started working on it, there were all of these deals being announced, things like House of Cards. Suddenly you had digital TV series that were completely independent. So we thought the way to do it would be to go through Kickstarter and let the fans see if they could pull together and help us make it. And they did. So we actually got our Kickstarter money. Then we attracted some more producing partners. And now we are in the process of casting. We're going to be filming in just a couple of months. And it's all going really well. And by the way, if anyone wants to audition, we have open auditions for Claire and Eve going on right now. And you can do a video audition. There's information at morganvilletheseries.com. You can download the audition materials and send them in by email because we're technological. At the same time as all that was happening, I heard back on a script that I'd written years ago, and it was from a mystery novel I did that sold exactly 200 copies, maybe, if that. There's always someone in the audience who says, "I have that book." I'm like, you and me, we're the only ones. But there was a producer that found a copy, really liked it, and read the script. And he had been for years trying to put a deal together. All of a sudden, the deal came together. And I was told early this year that we're actually in pre-production for the movie. We have a director now. So things are moving forward. And there's actually 2 IMDb listings. The Internet Movie Databases, I have 2 listings. This is very exciting. Well, to me. So that's kind of where we are on that. And just, a lot of things going on, and short stories to write, and scripts to write, and books to write. All my life revolves around writing. It does. That's why the backpack is next to me. I don't get to play video games anymore. Does anybody have questions for me? I will tell you a little bit about my Romeo and Juliet book, though, first. Okay. Yes. You're passionate. I like that. Prince of Shadows was an idea that came to me. My ideas come from weird things. I should probably have made that clear with the whole Morganville streetlight story. This particular one came because I was on Twitter, which is a common way to avoid writing. And one of my friends said, "Oh, I need to finish this story I'm writing about Tybalt." And I thought, where do I know that name? Tybalt, of course, Romeo and Juliet. And I remembered the play pretty well, and I thought, wow, that's great. I never thought of doing an alternate viewpoint of Romeo and Juliet. It's been done for other things, but not for Romeo and Juliet. And I thought, wow, that's great. I think of all these things I could do and these ways I could redraw the characters. And And I thought, well, no, I can't, because she's writing it, obviously. She's doing that story. The next tweet was, I mean, of course, Tybalt, my cat. And all I tweeted was, thank you. So she's actually in the dedication of the book. I'm sure I'll be getting a bill shortly. But that's how it came about, was just this brainstorm idea. And I spent about 6 months researching the play. I talked to a lot of historians, a lot of Shakespeare scholars, and discussed various ideas with them. And the end result was something kind of magical for me, because it's so different than I'd done before. The biggest hurdle to doing it was that I wanted to set it in the actual time period. I wanted to have Shakespearean language, but still have it read accessibly to modern readers. So that took a couple of tries, maybe 3. And I think that I got it finally, and I've heard back from a lot of people that said it's surprising how you fall into this language when you read it. That's what I wanted. So I was very excited about that, and the characters just came alive for me in ways that I hadn't really foreseen. And that's when you know a book is worth writing, because the characters just begin to take on a life of their own and go without you. And that's very much what happened. I didn't even know what they were doing half the time, but I knew when they came back they would tell me, and they did. So Romeo and Juliet is one of those stories that everyone knows, and yet, oddly enough, I find many people don't really remember the details of it. So even though it's a familiar story, I think it'll surprise people. Because even if you do know the story, you're going to find new ways to look at it through this retelling. Anybody got questions? Somebody always asks, are you doing another Morganville book? I might. But not right now. Only because I have other things I want to work on. But we are going to do a book of short stories, and I'm working on short stories the latter part of this year to get them ready for that. I'm probably about a third of the way done with it right now. Yes. This is going to be all Morganville, all me. No, I wouldn't ask anybody else to try to write Morganville. They'd be like, crazy people? There's a vampire with bunny slippers on? What? By the way, the bunny slippers, I own them. They're in my house. They're comfortable. They're tricky on stairs, though. Be careful. Anybody got questions? I have also done a lot of anthology work, as you mentioned. And one of the things that most recently came out was Dark Duets, which was edited by Christopher Golden. And Christopher is one of those guys. I knew his books, but until I started talking to him, I didn't realize how many things he did. He's a massively creative person, and he does a lot of comic work. He does film work. He's the only person I know who sold a movie off of a synopsis. He didn't even write the book first. So yeah, he's pretty special. And having him, he invited Charlaine Harris into this anthology, and the rule was you had to write a story with someone else, but it had to be someone you'd never written with before. And so Charlaine said, well, I don't know who I'd pick. And then she said, oh, yes, I do. And she called me. And you don't say no. Let me just say that. You say yes and yes again. In fact, she asked me while we were watching the Hunger Games, because we'd gone to the Hunger Games premiere, and my husband was sitting between us. And right before the movie started, she leaned over and she said, would you like to co-write a story with me? And I said, yes. And then the movie came up, and that was all I could ask her. But it turned out to be an amazing experience, and the anthology is really, really cool. I just did a signing at Mysterious Galaxy for it in California, and when you start looking at the number of people that are in this anthology and the star power that he put together, it's pretty amazing. And the stories are fantastic. I'm not counting mine. Although Charlene's, certainly I can count her. I also did an anthology called Kicking It, it's a themed anthology, which goes back to my earlier story about the prompts. Themed anthologies are kind of like Mad Libs for writers. Someone will say, okay, we're going to take two completely disparate things and ask you to write a story about them. And the first one was actually a Charlene Harris anthology. And the theme was vampires and birthdays. It was called Many Bloody Returns. So I kind of got the bug after doing that one. So I got into a lot of themed anthologies. But the most recent one is called Kicking It. And it is magic and boots. So I have cursed cowboy boots. Demonically cursed cowboy boots at that. And it's set in Austin, which is one of my favorite places. I have another story coming out in a themed anthology next week. And that one's called Stamps, Tramps, and Vamps. And I asked for clarification, and I said, wait, does it have to be literal? And they said, well, it needs to have a vampire in it. And you can use any interpretation you like of the other two words. So mine is set in the Depression era with tramps on trains. So, because I'm crazy like that. And I like history. Yeah.
In the books I've read, you have really interesting characters. I was wondering whether they're all kind of some that you come up with in your mind, or any of them have like a backstory to them.
The characters that I come up with tend to have. I start usually from 4 questions that I ask myself, and one of them is, what do they like? What do they dislike? What do they want? What do they fear? And once I know those 4 things and their situation, I can kind of figure out most of their personality, and then I try to figure out what's going to make them more well-rounded. But I try not to base them on anyone I know, because I did that once. Very awkward Christmas. There are people who do it all the time, and they must have more forgiving relatives than me. The crazy thing was, everybody thought that they were the one that I had picked to be the character, and none of them were happy with how I portrayed them. They weren't in the book, but it didn't matter. So, I don't really think I can go about it too terribly scientifically, other than those 4 questions. But they all have to have their own voice. And sometimes it takes a while and several drafts to get the individual voices down in my head so that they're consistent across the length of the novel. Morganville was surprisingly easy, though. Every one of those characters came into being with their own voice almost immediately. And I don't know where Merlin came from. Don't ask me. He's a bipolar vampire with bunny slippers. You cannot make that up. I don't know why I did. Yes.
You said that Morganville vampires came from the idea of streetlights, but after you got that idea, what came first, the characters or the world building for that series?
I felt like the world building had to come first for Morganville, simply because I needed to understand the town before I understood the people. The environment seemed to me to influence the kind of people who would be there, why they would stay, why they wouldn't leave. All of those things had to come from the environment they were in. And I started questioning, first of all, why would people live there? But then I look around at the news and I think, why are people living in terrible situations all over the world? Mostly because they can't leave, or because they don't want to leave. They are determined to stick it out. So I figured there was that mix of people in Morganville, and with varying degrees of, I wish I could go, but I can't. I like that. You've got hand delivery. Good for you. Anybody else?
myself as kind of a character. And that series, to me, has an immense progression of growth in the characters and in the story. I'm curious, it got more mature as the series went on. Did you find that the introduction of new adult in the industry it had something to do with that?
You know, it's funny because it wasn't so much the introduction of new adult, although that did happen concurrently probably with the last 3 books, so much as the fact that I felt like the characters had to grow up. Because if you're going to do 15 books in a series, you're already having to artificially slow down their aging process pretty significantly. They only aged 3 years, 2.5 years in all 15 books. But I had to let them grow up or else it just felt weird. So yeah, it did get gradually more mature as I went along. But I really didn't think about the new adult because that's a completely separate shelf. Not so much a shelf right now as kind of an ebook thing, but a completely different subgenre. And the rules of that are completely different than young adult. Curiously, the rules of young adult are not really rules so much as guidelines, kind of like Pirates of the Caribbean. We all had different expectations from our publishers, and we all started talking at some point. And we all realized we had different limits. So it just depended on where we were writing and what we were writing as to what we could do. I'm pretty sure there are some young adult novels that really tip over into new adult, but I didn't really want to do that with this because I have a lot of very young readers, 11, 12. So.
I always call it young adult, but not so young adult.
That's one thing I love about having such a crossover audience is I get probably about 50% of my audience as adults reading young adult. And when I'm in England, I get multi-generational families reading it, which is fun. I get grandma and mom and the daughter and the granddaughter all reading the same series. Maybe they won't let the granddaughter read it past, like book 6. But anybody else? I'll tell you my schedule because that's always something aspiring writers like to know details. It sounds a lot more exciting than it is to be a writer. I know Castle is one thing. Castle has a really nice loft. And he never writes. Do you ever notice that? Richard Castle never writes. He's always in the midst of about to write. And a murder will happen. I wish that would happen around my house. Murders hardly ever interrupt my writing. Well, except that one time, but we won't talk about that. The sad truth is I discovered I was not writing full-time. I had a day job for many years until about 2009, 2010. And so I was working about 60, 70 hours a week at that job. But I had to keep writing more and more books, too. So I discovered that there was a coffee shop that was open at 5:30 by my office. If I went in at 5:30, my commute was very short. There was coffee. I could get things done for 3 hours before the day started. So I did it from necessity, and I hate mornings. But I discovered something odd, which was I got more done during those 3 hours than I did any other time of the day. That's terrible. So I began to set my writing time as early mornings, and I still do it. Even while I'm on this tour, I'm getting up at 5:30 in the morning and writing before I go to the airport to catch a plane because I get a lot done. I write about 7, 8 hours a day, but I start early morning, and I'm usually done about noon or 1 o'clock. And then I do business stuff in the afternoons. There's a ridiculous lot of business stuff. Emails, lots of that. And then I spend the nights, as most people do, with their families and doing fun stuff and cooking and watching movies. And it's not an action-packed life. Yeah.
So in between that, when you plan Twitter?
Yeah, I plan Twitter when I'm stuck. When I'm looking at the next scene and going, I need some M&Ms and Twitter. Maybe Plants vs. Zombies. It's my obsession. I have a great Zen garden in Plants vs. Zombies. Hey, don't laugh. I've got 500,000 coins in there right now. Anybody else?
Anybody else got a high score of Plants vs. Zombies?
Did you have to go back and reread, Romeo and Juliet before you started, or did you just? I mean, I'm assuming you did a lot of research.
I did.
It was just the play, or did you branch out?
I started with the play.
And I went back and I actually bought a book, cut apart the pages, and put them all, I basically color-coded the whole thing, and I went through and I analyzed it myself. And then after I'd done that, I read a bunch of critical analysis of the play. And then after I'd done that, I went through and tried to overlay my plot on top of it and figure out timings and characters. And because what's interesting is Rosaline in Romeo and Juliet is what they call a ghost character. She's not actually a ghost. She just never appears. They talk about her. She's never on stage. So I had a lot of freedom with her. And all I had to do was make sure Benvolio was in the right place at the right time for the scenes he was in. So it's kind of an interesting puzzle looking at it sideways. But yeah, I did a ton of research. I also recommend, there's a book called The Murder of a Medici Princess. It's a great research book for that period. Also very dark, because obviously murder. But it tells a lot about how the role of women and the role of children in that era and young adults. And I think it's really a great story as well. There, by some coincidence, there were 2 Romeo and Juliet books coming out the same day. It was this Prince of Shadows, and Jenny Trout had a book coming out called Such Sweet Sorrow. And I'm dying to read this book now. I can read it now. I didn't want to read it before. But it's Romeo going into the underworld to try to retrieve Juliet. And Hamlet is his guide, much like Dante. So, yeah, go get that. It's good. I haven't read it yet, but I'm sure it's good. I love Jenny. By the way, I do read extensively in the genre. I read in all genres because I believe that you really need to kind of feed your mind as much as you can as a writer. But there's so much good stuff in young adult. It's ridiculous. On the other in the other building there, a whole wall this big just of young adult. And I probably have read maybe 1/10 of it, if that. And I feel guilty because I really want to read it all. So what happens is while I'm on these tours at every bookstore, I tend to buy at least 2 books. My suitcase keeps edging toward heavy because when you're on a trip for 10 days and you have to go through Chicago in sub-zero climates and Miami in the same 3 days, you tend to pack a lot. There's not a lot of room for books. So I just sent FedEx full of books last night home. So I guess I know what I'll be doing when I get home, besides writing. Yeah.
So not to call like Romeo and Juliet like a historical event, but it kind of has like its history and it like you were using a basis for your novel. Mm-hmm. Did you like doing that more than starting it off from your mind?
From modern day kind of thing, or yeah, I really felt like after reading the play again, I felt like the time period was quite important to the story I wanted to tell. Not that you couldn't do a modern day interpretation. Obviously, they do them a lot. But there are certain elements of it that I find very, very important, and that is the lack of choice that people had in their lives at that period. Even if you were a well-off young man, you didn't have a lot of choices because your family controlled your money. And you had no place to go, and you were at the mercy of your family's agenda always. So it really spoke to me in a historical sense more than in a modern day sense. And what's interesting, too, is Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare pretty much adapted a previous play into Romeo and Juliet. It's actually, I think, at least 3 plays farther back of that story. that he had drawn from in his interpretation. So it's a very old story, but it continues to speak to people, which I think is fascinating. All of his work does.
Are you planning anything else from the world that you created in Princess Shadow? Sorry.
Did she steal your question?
Do you plan anything else for the world that you created and started in Prince of Shadows for the future?
I've been asked that question, and I just am not sure, because to me, I envisioned it as a standalone story, and I didn't know what other Shakespeare plays I might want to do that with. I have the opportunity to do it. I'm still reading through plays, trying to find what I think would be a good fit. There is Two Gentlemen of Verona, which is a play not many people know much about, which could be kind of fun to do. And I could actually transfer some characters over, at least in a guest starring role. But I don't know. It's been kind of running through my mind on this trip, but jury's out. I got a lot of work. I don't know. What am I working on right now? I have a secret project. I can't spill it. It's a short story though that's going to be out, I think, later this year. When I can talk about it, I will. But it's secret. I'm also working on rewrites for the scripts, and I've also got another novel that I'm doing edits on. But I can't talk about that one either. Seriously, my husband's like, "Can I talk about anything?" No. He starts answering questions at conventions, and I'm going, no, we're not doing it. Remember? He's bad at that. My husband, by the way, is an artist, which is very helpful, because he doesn't really want to be a writer, and I don't want to be an artist because I'm not good at it. And so we work independently from each other, and all we do is get together and say, "Ooh, I like what you've done. Ooh, I like what you've done." It really keeps us from critiquing each other too much. When you have two creative people in the household, sometimes that can be a problem. Anybody else? Oh, I did want to. Yeah, go ahead.
You said that you've read a lot of other things in the genres you write. So speaking of young adult, if you could combine your universe with someone else's for like a single crossover story, just random curiosity, who would it be?
It's a great question. Probably Cassandra Clare. Although I'm not sure who would win that fight. You know, I'm thinking my vampires are pretty tough, but she's got angels, so not too even there. I don't really know. I mean, Rochelle Mead's vampires would probably be pretty well matched with mine, but she's got a movie, and I'm going to let her have that one. Anybody seen the movie Vampire Academy? Okay, I'm going when I get home, so I'm excited. I wish I could answer that one coherently, but I'm trying to think of a good crossover, and there's so many series I love. But mine is so weird. Although I would kind of pay money to have a story where Magnus Bane and Merlin have to work together. I'll just call Cassie and ask her. Yeah, that's it. Cassie, if you're watching. I will tell you who my favorite young adult author is, because I shout about her books all the time. Holly Black. Holly's, she's got a book called White Cat. And when I read White Cat, I thought, I should stop now, because it's just that good. And she's probably the one author I consistently say, if I could be Holly Black, I would be a happy, happy person. She's a beautiful writer, lovely person, but amazing. Anybody? You're a quiet crowd. I've been doing school visits all week, and usually there's like hands going up, crazy questions, like, what kind of dog food do you buy? None, because I don't have a dog. Next question. I love school visits because, and I do them pretty frequently. But one of the interesting things is you never know what you're going to get when you go on a school visit. Either it could be an entire class of 2,000 people, most of whom have no interest in being there, or it could be the writing class that's really engaged and interested and wants to ask you a million questions. So it's kind of a crapshoot as to what you're going to get when you walk in the door of a school, and I find that really fun. I just make up stuff just to see if they're paying attention. What's my method of writing? Well, I write away for ideas from Idea Factory. It's $5.99 a month, just like Netflix. I wish that were true, by the way.
I always wanted to ask you this in one of our interviews, and I never did. Do you have a character across your series that came super easy to you? One that you just found kind of wrote itself?
Yeah, as far as characters that came super easy, Mernon from Morganville, I don't know why. But I knew I had a scientist character. I'd written one in the outline. And I thought, scientist goes here. And I got to that scene, and I thought, okay, now I need to think about the scientist. And I just started typing without thinking about the scientist. And he was insane. And I looked at it, and I thought, I should erase that, because he's insane. But then the more I looked at it, the more I liked it. So that was the one that just kind of came out of nowhere, and I really don't know why. He was fully dressed. He had on his bunny slippers. He was ready to go. Somewhere in the back of my mind, something weird happened. Maybe I didn't sleep that night. I don't know. Maybe I should try more not sleeping. Oh, wait. I have. I'm on tour. My bag was lost in Chicago. My suitcase was missing for almost 24 hours. And one of the things that happens is you lay there and you think about where your bag is the whole night. So we actually started a little conversation on Twitter about the adventures of my bag. I believe that it was abducted by aliens. The aliens sent me a note that said, your bag is in the middle of a field next to a dead cow. Got a ransom note for my bag. It was pretty great.
There's a short story idea right there.
Yeah, there is.
Or someone's going to go fanfic on it. It's going to go crazy.
The anthology of stories about my suitcase.
Right.
And the follow-up anthology, what's in my suitcase?
Yeah.
Because that's probably indeterminate right now. Last tour, I traveled with a projector and a screen, and a 6-foot movie screen that I carried. It was gigantic through 10 airports. And after the first airport, I realized this was a really bad idea, not for the logistical problems so much. TSA. You've got something that looks like a giant bazooka strapped to your back. You think they're not going to search you? Every time I opened the screen, the TSA notices would just fly out of it. They would open it at least 5 times every stop. So yeah, no screen this time. Sorry, guys. We are gonna, when I get back home, we're actually having as part of a larger signing event that has 75 authors at the Adventures in Fiction Festival in Dallas. We're actually sponsoring the Prince of Shadows masked ball. And while I'm on the road, I've been lining up all of the reenactors who are going to come and do stage fighting for us in the middle of the ball. There's no problem with that, right? Should I tell the hotel? Maybe I should. That's one thing I like about doing historicals. You get to order clothes. You get to have dresses custom made, and it's tax deductible, right? I think so. I'm not sure. My accountant has never worked with a writer before, and she's like, she looks at my receipts and goes, "What are you talking about here?" I'll teach her. Yes, books are a business expense. They are. Anybody? Questions? You're such a quiet crowd. Yes.
With so many ideas floating around in your head, how do you pick one and commit to it?
I tend to be a serial idea person. So usually I have one really good idea at a time, and that's the one I focus on. It's not universally true. Sometimes I have 3 or 4, but usually there's one that stands out to me as being a really strong candidate, and that's the one I pick. But I don't throw the other ones away. What I do is I write them down somewhere. I have a little file on my computer that's the idea file, and it's just bullet points. And often I look at the bullet points and say, yeah, that's never going to work. Story about cheese taking over the world. Yeah, that's not going to work. Wrote that at 2 a.m. But the oddest thing, ideas are really funny because the more you write, I think the more ideas you have this sense that develops of what's a good idea and what's not. But you never stop with the obvious. You always ask yourself why. Why would that happen? What's the worst thing that can happen associated with that? If I have a person haunted by bad weather, what does she use to control the weather? Now, what if she's dying? What if she's on the run? What if people are trying to kill her? And she's getting hit by lightning. Excellent. Because I'm weird. Yeah.
This genre that you mainly stick to, do you think anything in your life contributed to that being where you find your inspiration?
It's a good question because I realized I've only written one book without a paranormal element. Only one my entire career. And that's the one that sold 200 copies. I find that writing just straight contemporary stories doesn't really appeal to me as strongly. I've tried them and I get about halfway through and I start thinking, but wouldn't it be so much cooler with a ghost? Really? Wouldn't it? Maybe that's just a function of me and my life, but I do live in a haunted house, so it might have something to do with it. I've often asked other people that question because I know a lot of people who write straight contemporary fiction. And they don't tend to think in terms of what's the craziest thing that can happen. They want to look at the everyday and make it explicable and meaningful, which is great. I like to look at really big things. So the bigger the plot is, the happier I am. The bigger the danger. So that's why often I'm trying to destroy the world 9 times in the Weather Warden series. I didn't manage to do it, though, so maybe I'm not doing it right. I don't know. I'm pretty sure that if you blow up the world, people will hate you, though, at the end of a series. Has anybody done that? At the end of a long series, blown up the universe and killed everybody?
How would they end it? It would just be a blank page.
Yeah, and then there would be riots and Twitter wars and ugly death threats. So let's not do that. Yeah, I do know that there's been backlash over people who've killed their main characters. So
I hear people whispering names. I only killed mine a little. She's mostly alive.
I killed Joanne 2 or 3 times in the Weather Warden series, but she wouldn't stay dead, so it doesn't count. That's the other thing I like about Paranormal is you can have these huge events that seem like you can't escape from them, and yet you can because it's not that you're breaking the rules, you've set up the rules, but the rules are not the same rules we live by. But you have to be consistent. Magic doesn't solve everything. And I think that's what it's attractive about it to me, is the idea that even if you are super powerful, it doesn't matter in many situations. But I didn't give her kryptonite either, so that's why they invented kryptonite for Superman. After a few stories, they were like, oh boy, what can we do to really challenge him? I don't know, take his powers away.
With that in mind, I'm not sure how you're going to answer this without spoilers, but or if you can, like I said, you've had a couple instances in across your series, different series, where I got to the end and I was like, wow, she kind of wrote herself into a corner. Has there been one that was like, wow, how am I going to write myself back out of this in the next book? Or did you know? Was there...
Oh, I always know how I'm going to get out of a situation that I write my characters into in the finished book. In the drafts, often I will write them into a corner and then sit there and stare at it and think, okay, they're on a sinking ship in the middle of the ocean and no one's coming to help them. What do I do now? The whale swallowing them doesn't seem reasonable. Go play on Twitter and someone will give me the answer. But yeah, I usually that happens in the draft for me, where I explore all kinds of different scenarios. It's also why it's fiendishly difficult for writers to catch mistakes in the finished novel, because a reader is only seeing one version of it. They're seeing the finished version, whereas the writer is seeing 16 versions in their head of all of the decision trees they took, didn't take. They're all equally real to them. So it's one of those things that I wish we could turn off, but we really can't. Even after we finish the book, we can't always remember whether or not we killed that character in the last book. We rely a lot on editors for that, to tell us, you can't have him back. He's dead. It's happened more than once. And then I just said, well, it is magic, right? I actually moved a city from New Jersey to Maine. And that was embarrassing because no one caught it. It was in the finished book. And the very first hour it was out, someone wrote to me and said, didn't this city used to be in New Jersey? I said, yes, magic. Another reason I like Paranormal. Well, it was a legitimate argument because it was actually a city that the genies controlled. So theoretically, it could move. No reason for it. I get some great questions as soon as the book comes out, though. There's always someone who will tell me that something was misspelled on page 306. And I love that, but I can't fix it. So I just say, I'm sorry. I'll try to do better. And I do try. But I have one day to check proofs, so probably not going to get that much better. Anybody questions? I will tell you anything you want to know about writing. Not that I know everything. I know a little bit. Been doing it long enough. Yeah.
Have you ever thought about shying away from paranormal and going more into Greek philosophy and gods and different kinds of power?
Mm-hmm. I tend to shy away from the whole idea of doing really powerful creatures. I like to focus on mortals and their problems with immortals, because writing something purely from the perspective of people who are that powerful is tough. One of the reasons I think that Rick Riordan's books work so well is that the kids are just learning what it means to be demigods. They don't really have any idea when the book first starts, and their parents are pretty much absent. And when your parent is a god and absent, that's pretty bad. You don't really know anything about your life. I've considered it, but all the ideas that I've had have tended to be more about everyday things versus giant mythological things. One of these days, I got plenty of space, right? I could go to 60 books. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
You ever done like expository more things, or more focused toward narrative, and like in school, did you enjoy narratives a lot more than?
I like narrative fiction. I've done a lot of different styles, and I've done epistolary novels. I've done, I do nonfiction. I've done a lot of different things, but narrative is the piece that I really enjoy sinking into, because you're creating your own world and your own character set. It's like living in a movie. It's a little harder to do that if you're doing like an epistolary novel where it's told in a series of letters back and forth to people. It can be done and done beautifully. I just don't think it's my forte. But yeah, there's one of the key things about being a writer is you got to try everything and figure out where your strengths are. And then work on your weaknesses, because your weaknesses can become your strengths if you work on them hard enough. I was told early on that I was terrible at dialogue. And so I worked really hard on my dialogue. And I think now it's probably one of my strengths. Setting. I had a problem with setting, and now I spend a lot of time on setting. But I think it's just recognizing where you might not have an instinct for it right off the bat, and then figuring out how to bring something else to it.
When you write something, do you always start with the beginning of the story, or do you move around in different parts of it?
I'm really linear as a writer. I tend to start at the beginning and write it straight through. But that's not necessarily a rule. There are plenty of people I know who jump around and write different things, put it together at the end. I don't know how they do that. To me, that's like doing large math in your head. I remember Diana Gabaldon saying that she wrote her books on, or her outlines on index cards, and she would put them on the wall and she would shuffle them around until a plot formed. I can't do that. It has to be, everything has to immediately lead in my mind to the next thing, or I can't figure out where that's going. Although I have skipped things, because sometimes what I do when everybody gets writer's block to some extent or another, it's just a common thing. Sometimes Plants vs. Zombies becomes an addiction, and you don't want to go back to the writing. So what I do is, if I'm having trouble on a scene, I will skip the scene, go to the next thing I know, write forward, then go back and fill in what I've missed. Or I will realize that I've taken a wrong turn, and I'll back up and I'll cut until I get to the point where I know where I'm going, and then I'll write it again. I've written things sometimes 3 and 4 times till I got it going the right direction. It's not the most pleasant process to cut your work and watch it go away. So I usually cut it and paste it. And I can delete that document later, but at least I don't have to see it just vanish. And I have lost entire books before. That's why I learned the importance of backup. I don't have 4 for every book. I email it to myself at particular times during the book, and then I have online backups and hard drive backups, and print out a copy, because I'm paranoid now. Yeah.
Do you remember what books you lost? Or?
I remember vividly, especially the one that I was almost done with. And this was way back in the technologically dark ages. I had a laptop. It was one of the first laptops, but it didn't really have a hard drive. It had floppies, and they were the big floppies, like the plate size. And they didn't save unless you told it to save. It was no autosave. So I was typing, and I was really on a roll, and all of a sudden I was sitting on the floor and my laptop started to tip, and I grabbed it and I hit the power button and turned it off, and the entire thing was gone when I turned it on again. So yeah, I remember that one really well, because I had to rewrite the whole thing from scratch. I lost probably about 100 pages. I'm just going to say it was probably better the second time I wrote it, because that's the only way I can sleep nights. Anybody else?
It probably depends on whether it's an open versus a closed society, but the importance of human characters. Do you find it easier to write your human characters or your gifted paranormal characters?
Human characters are always, I think, easier to write in some sense, because you know the world they're in. You know their experience because it's yours. The paranormal characters require a little more imagination about what they're going through. But I don't know if I like writing either one better, particularly. It really depends on the character and their situation. Sometimes if a character is going through a really tough situation, it doesn't matter whether they're just a normal person or a gifted character or a genie or what have you. It's just tough to write. And you always at some point feel really guilty for putting your characters through that. Well, people often ask me, do you hesitate to kill characters? And I was on a panel with a bunch of other writers, and I was first to answer that question. And I gave an honest answer, which was absolutely not. I love killing characters. Killing characters is one of the greatest things you get to do as a writer. Because you get to set up a character so that their end means something. Their fate is important. And to me, that was powerful and a great way to do it. And then everybody else on the panel was like, no, I hate killing characters. I just can't do it. I can't bring myself to it. So I sounded like a total psychopath. But I still like killing characters. I admit it. I promise that I won't kill anybody in the next book. No, I can't promise that. Oh, well. It's part of what people know me for. That and cliffhangers. By the way, I'm terrible at writing cliffhangers. I write them all the time. And I started out just doing it because it was fun for me. And it helped me get into the next book if I had a problem to immediately solve right off the bat. It didn't require a lot of setup. And I wasn't going to put any cliffhangers in my young adult books. And I turned it in, the first Morganville book, and my characters were sitting around the dinner table saying, wow, that was crazy, wasn't it? I'm so glad we're safe now. The end. And my editor came back and said, no, you must make it a cliffhanger because I need people to feel the danger going into the next book. So I did this, probably the worst cliffhanger I ever did on the end of Glass Houses. And then she said, that's great. Now, can you write me a sample chapter for the next book to put at the end of the book? I said, how is it a cliffhanger if I give you the ending of the cliffhanger in the sample chapter? So we had to compromise and do something completely different at the end because I was not going to let people off the hook with that sample chapter. I wanted people to think that I'd killed that character. By golly. I didn't. I do get, sometimes I do get reviewers who say, I hate cliffhangers, and if you keep doing them, I'll kill you. But then I also get reviewers that say, I should hate this cliffhanger, but I don't. I like those. I am trying to avoid. Look, I did a whole book that does not have a cliffhanger. I'm very proud of that. Well, guys, I guess we're ready to wrap up, right? We're getting there. Thank you. Would you?
Folks, we do have the book and all of her backlist on sale behind the counter. Rachel will sign it over here. Also, she can be reached at rachelcaine.com, Facebook, Twitter, and right here at Books and Books. If you're watching online, call the store. We'll get a book signed for you and ship it to you. No charge. Thank you so much for coming.